Hi, my name is Rachel Sauer, and I'm here today to talk about bombs and freight trains and any of the other ways that people describe what it's like to live through a tornado. Those were just some of the ways that people who lived through a tornado on May 22nd, 2011 in Joplin, Missouri described the experience. It was the seventh deadliest tornado in US history since things like that have been recorded, and it was a tremendously devastating disaster just all around. But it is a very interesting case study for seeing an incident command system put into practice and operating well, and to see emergency operations plans also being put into practice and operating the way that they should. So it's good and bad. Horrible that this thing happened, but there's a lot that we can learn from it. But before we talk about Joplin, let's talk about the 2011 tornado season, which was no good. 2011 was a bad year going into May of 2011. Throughout April, there had been just a spate of tornadoes, and a particularly bad clump of them from April 26th to April 28th of 2011, from about Alabama all the way to Virginia. There had been 343 tornadoes that had caused 321 deaths, which was, by April 28th, the region was reeling, the country was reeling, thinking, how could it get worse than this? Things are really bad. But then May 22nd happened. But before we talk about the tornado, let's talk a little bit about Joplin, Missouri. In 2011, it had a population of about 50,000, so it was more of a town, higher daytime population, and it did have experience with tornadoes. It had been hit by tornadoes in May 1971 and May 1973. So May was not the greatest month for Joplin. But Joplin is in a place it's an area of the country called Tornado Alley. I think we've all heard that term. That's just a cone where the weather conditions are rife for tornadoes. So Joplin, because it did have history and experience with tornadoes directly in the city, and then that there had been several other tornadoes outside the city throughout its history. It, in about 1970, had started installing outdoor storm sirens. So by 2011, it had 25 outdoor storm sirens. They were tested every Monday at 10 a.m. for 1 minute, unless there was a thunderstorm forecast. But this was not a town. This is a town that was not unfamiliar with tornadoes. However, May 22nd, it's just, we say it's the perfect storm. It really was. A cold and warm fronts clashed over the central U.S. They created supercell thunderstorms that became tornadoes. So on the 22nd, which was a Sunday, by 1:40 p.m., the National Weather Service had issued a tornado watch for parts of Missouri, Arkansas, Kansas, and Oklahoma. And the National Weather Service does this whenever there's significant weather activity, but I think that we've become a little desensitized to these warnings. And that's certainly research after Joplin has shown that that does happen. So by late afternoon, storm chasers are reporting multiple vortices west of Joplin. And at 4:45, the National Weather Service, in conjunction with Joplin and Jasper County, which is its county authorities, began tracking the actual tornadoes that were forming west of Joplin. And at 5:17 p.m., the National Weather Service in Springfield, Missouri, issued tornado warnings for Joplin. So at that point, the city of Joplin sounded the tornado sirens for 3 minutes. And they sounded them again at 5:31 p.m. for 3 minutes. Now, the important thing to know is that the tornado touched down at 5:41 p.m. So between 5:17 and 5:41, that's 24 minutes that the people of Joplin had to prepare for what would be the worst storm that has ever hit Joplin, seventh deadliest storm in history since storms have been tracked. And that's not a lot of time. So in less than a minute, which again, I'm sure living through the tornado and reports afterward said it seems like an infinity. The tornado wrought the kind of damage that most importantly and most devastatingly would lead to 161 fatalities, which is unimaginable destruction, and more than 1,300 injuries, some of them critical. The tornado was on the ground through Joplin for 6 miles, and the town it's not that big. So 6 miles, I think, because its total path was 22 miles, but 6 miles is a lot of the town of Joplin from the west to the southeast. And at points, it was 3/4 of a mile wide. And the thing to remember is the tornado was rated an EF5, which is the highest it's on the tornado rating scale. 5 means winds in excess of 200 miles per hour, which is mind-boggling. It hit neighborhoods in the business district, which really exacerbated the devastation, and it destroyed 4,300 homes, more than 4,300, and damaged more than 3,800 homes. It destroyed one of the major hospitals for the region, St. John's Regional Medical Center, the high school. It significantly damaged businesses, including Home Depot and Walmart, which in a town the size of Joplin, that's a big deal. That's where people shop. It ruined 130 transmission poles, so immediately 18,000 people were without electricity. And so about 30% of Joplin was impacted by this, and it generated an estimated 3 million cubic yards of debris, which is mind-boggling. That's a mind-boggling amount of debris. So immediately, this was the reason this storm is important for us to study as public health practitioners and people who are interested in disaster response, is that it showed us how to do a lot of things right. Mistakes were made, but a lot of things were done right. So immediately after the tornado, Joplin and Jasper County officials recognized that this was beyond their ability to totally deal with this disaster. It was so huge that they obviously couldn't deal with it alone. So they activated their mutual aid agreements that they had in place with the regional partners through the Southwest Missouri Incident Support Team and the Four Corners Emergency Management. The IST helped to establish command and restore communications at the EOC, the Emergency Operations Center. And then the Four Corners helped to manage requests for assistance, because Joplin was sending out requests. They were enacting their mutual aid agreements, but also people were offering to help. So that was great, but there was just a lot going on. So that alone shows us a well thought out, well planned, and well considered incident command system that is practiced beforehand, where all the players know their parts, where the roles are defined, the structure of how things will happen is defined. This alone shows us the necessity of that. So it's very interesting, because again, these previously established mutual aid agreements meant that people from more than 400 public safety organizations responded to Joplin. So that alone is really that's a lot of manpower to help with a devastating event. But it also again shows that there was an element of chaos, but it could have been so much worse if the EOP had not been in place to maintain a structure, an organizational and operational and logistical structure for dealing with this, responding to this emergency. If that had not been in place, it would have been a disaster of another kind. And it also shows us that I think, again, we've talked in our readings. It's one thing to read in a textbook about what happens at the local level, what happens at the state level, what happens at the federal level. But this shows us that there were players at each level in responding to this disaster. And again, having the incident command system organized beforehand, having the emergency operations plan in place beforehand, helped to know where each piece was going to fall in, because this was, as the quote on the previous page, President Obama said, this is a national disaster, and it was a national disaster. So immediately afterward, then Governor Jay Nixon activated the State Emergency Operations Center. He mobilized the Missouri National Guard, directed the Missouri State Highway Patrol to send all troopers to the area, so that within 24 hours of this tornado striking Joplin, there were 800 police cars, 300 ambulances, 400 fire trucks, 1,100 responders who had arrived in Joplin under the auspices of an EOP. So that's a lot of response, but it was a lot of disaster. So it was necessary. But that shows us that, again, the incident command system only functions as well as its plan does. So, and it's interesting to me, just as a side note, I just want to quickly talk about St. John's Regional Medical Center, which was the regional medical center for this area, is often held up as an example of what to do, because we talk about an ICS at a local level, at a state level, at a federal level, but St. John's also had their own ICS that the storm siren sounded, and as soon as the tornado hit, they put their ICS into play. So within 90 minutes of this, because their building was almost totaled by this hurricane. That's the building there in the picture, as you can see. So within 90 minutes, they were able to evacuate 183 patients, and 28 of them were critical care, because they had their own ICS. And so the staff, each person knew their role, the leadership structure was in place, and so they were able to serve. And they did have some deaths because of a structural collapse, and so that was definitely a tragedy. But It would have been a lot worse if they didn't have their own ICS. So it's interesting to see that, organizations and that below municipalities, organizations can have their own ICS. And so they were able to coordinate with the Freeman Health System Hospital, which is about a mile away, to the point that staff were, walking back and forth. They triaged in the parking lot. They expected, part of the overall ICS was that they would be appointed. People were going to be taken to St. John's, and so they were expected to see surge, but instead they surged out of their own building, so that EMS were treating people. They would park, and then doctors would treat people in ambulances. That there were reports of that happening. They established a care site at Memorial Hall, turned the convention center into a temporary hospital. So this isn't a good example of what can happen when an individual level ICS works. And then also another interesting aspect of the response to the Joplin disaster is the power of social media. This was one of our first social media disasters, because almost immediately the telecommunications was a mess. Phone lines were knocked out, but and cell towers were knocked out. But to the degree that people still had cell service, they were texting friends, let them know they were okay. They were going to social media. This is what's happening. This is taking pictures, uploading video to YouTube, letting people know. And then almost immediately, Facebook pages were started to help victims. The Red Cross set up a Safe and Well page for Joplin, which they do for a lot of other disasters, but that happened almost immediately. There were crowdsourcing sites to share information. And it was really interesting, because organizations and responders use social media to get information out, say, here's where you should go, send us your pictures. They really harness the power to the point that social media is now a factor of communications in an EOP. You account for social media in your EOP when you're crafting the communications plan. And it also has brought up the conversation that in dealing with disasters, we have to worry about fake news, because we really saw in Joplin, lies spread like viruses. And so there was a lot of false information that was also spread on social media. So to the degree that you can, your EOP needs to account for how are we going to deal with fake news being spread after disaster, because that is definitely a reality of modern emergency response. And so another interesting thing that was part of dealing with dealing with Joplin, I'm losing my words, is the volunteer response. People wanted to help. People descended on Joplin immediately. And there's been a lot of conversation since Joplin in emergency response and crafting an EOP and setting up an incident command system, is how do we deal with that X factor of people wanting to help? Because you can account for, you have your mutual aid agreements here in place, and so you expect a certain crew to show up from other responder organizations, but just regular people showed up in the thousands, and not all of them were trained. And you actually had responders, off-duty caregivers and responders show up, and you can't account for them in your EOP, let alone just regular people. And they're in dangerous situations, and there's debris, and they could get hurt, and they're maybe not trained for it. So how do you account for that too? So that's been part of the conversation since 2011. Is it speaks well of us as a people that we want to help when disaster strikes, but how do you deal with church group just showing up? And thank you for showing up. Not to say disparage a church group, but that's part of the conversation now. That by November 2011, as you can see, more than 92,000 registered volunteers had come to Joplin to help, representing 749 different organizations. So how do we deal with that? And that's something that's come to the forefront since Joplin. And so there are a lot of lessons to be learned from the tornado that devastated Joplin, Missouri. Lessons about resilience, lessons about crafting and enacting an EOP, and what should happen, what an ICS should look like in dealing with something like that. So one of the big lessons is just making your plans that account for each level of organization, and how to account for their strengths, what the local organizations have to offer, and state organizations and federal organizations. So, for example, AmeriCorps, which had a presence in Joplin, and I think of AmeriCorps as teachers, but they had relationships at Missouri Southern State University, so they established a site at the university to register volunteers, because they had the organization, they had the capacity to do that. And I thought, that's brilliant. And within the first 24 hours, they registered 3,000 volunteers. And likewise, the ASPCA and the Humane Society had a presence in the state. So they came to Joplin and helped establish shelters and deal with the lost and missing pets, the pets who had gotten loose, were trying to be reunited with their owners. So they harnessed the power of social media to do that. And so again, that was taking advantage and harnessing their strength and what they're good at to help, be a part of this EOP. And then also another lesson to be learned is that disaster doesn't just crest like one wave. It's wave after wave after wave. You have the initial big wave, you have the tsunami of the tornado hitting and all the aftermath of that, of search and rescue, then recovery, then body recovery, which was a horrible job. And then, dealing with insurance and cleaning up debris and everything you have to deal with. But then it's wave after wave. 2 years after the tornado, there were several studies have shown that up to 20% of the residents of Joplin were experiencing PTSD symptoms. And, that's something that's public health practitioners, that has to be part of our conversation when we're talking about emergency response and crafting an EOP is, knowing that the response to this is going to come in waves, that, we can't just, we just think about, people could be getting tetanus, dealing with all this debris. And then 2 years later, they could be depressed. And we need to be concerned with that too, that it's not just, hey, bing, bang, boom, and we're done. I just don't think you're ever done. And then a really important thing to think about in Joplin that has received a lot of discussion is that how do we deal with people becoming desensitized to emergency preparedness and to warnings? How do we help people be prepared? It's finding a balance of putting enough of the fear in them that they have a safe place to go, they have an emergency plan for their family, for their church, for their school, so that they're respectful of what could happen, but not living in fear. Because their studies have shown since Joplin that people just stopped hearing the emergency sirens. It was every Monday, 10 a.m. You stop hearing it and you stop taking it seriously. So even though the sirens went off on a Sunday evening at dinner time for 3 minutes, people didn't take it seriously, as seriously as they should. And there was studies have shown there's a dichotomy. People who were older and had been through tornadoes before, were more likely to take it seriously. But that needs to be part of the conversation now as public health practitioners, is how do we help encourage people to take it seriously? How do we facilitate them taking it seriously, but just making that part of life and not telling them they need to live in fear? And then also, I think one of the really important lessons is to acknowledge that it's impossible to plan for everything. And that's something I've really thought about through this entire course is, we read the EOP from Oregon, and then some of the contingencies they had plans for, I just remember thinking, that is bonkers. Who even thought of that? When would that ever in a million years happen? And some of the things that happened in Joplin that I've been reading about, it's like, that's nuts. How did that happen? I mean, there were stories of help coming in, pallet loads of water, bottled water coming in on flatbeds, and then the Missouri Department of Transportation pulling them over for being overweight. And you think, oh my gosh, that happened. But then I also think it's one thing to plan and to train and to practice, but then we have to remember it's human beings. We are human beings responding to emergency, even in the role of caregiver or responder. And so I think about this poor MDOT employee. Everything's terrible. The world's upside down. So you fall back on procedure. I get that. I do get that. And I don't know if that's necessarily something you can account for. And so I think how do we get our minds around that element of uncertainty, that we do everything we can. We plan, we make that EOP as thorough as we possibly can, but then we also have to say things are going to happen that we cannot plan for. And that's, that to me is a lesson of Joplin too. So in conclusion, as public health practitioners, I just think it's important to look to examples like this and realize that there is no substitute for a good plan, for the communication and conversation that happens in times when the wind is not blowing and when the ribs are not falling off and everything isn't coming apart or seems to be coming apart. This is when we have conversations about what we will do when it is, and we establish the relationships and the agreements that will deal with things, that the disasters and the emergencies that inevitably happen, because they will and they do. And as public health practitioners, we Yeah, our number one job is to help people be prepared for that, help our communities do everything they can to get ready for that and to be resilient afterward. Thank you.